Meine Damen, meine Herren hier im Saal, große Dinge beginnen.
Ladies and gentlemen, here in the hall, we'll shortly make a start, so I'd ask you to take your seats, please.
Wir starten in Kürze.
We'll be making a start shortly, but before we do so, I have some organisational remarks for you here in the hall. First of all, very good to see you all, which is not part of the official protocol. If you should be sitting in front of a camera today, have a look at where they are. We would ask you to not get up, please, and to not stretch your arms so that we get a good view from back to the front. And if you'd like to make use of simultaneous interpreting, you have some devices over at the back where you first came into the room, so translation is available. I'd like to also welcome our guests on the live stream. That's the camera over there. Very good to see you as well, and some information to you on how you can participate in the event also from your homes. During the event, there's the possibility to use the small window below the live stream, the chat, to leave comments, to ask questions, and of course, especially during the discussion rounds that will take place tonight and tomorrow. So feel free to ask questions. For everyone here in the house and the guests on the live stream, if you are using social media, use the hashtag Egon Bahr 100.
Findet man auch hier, glaube ich, recht eingängig. Wenn Sie das also nutzen, zum Beispiel bei Twitter,
so if you want to make use of this on Twitter, for example, we can see what comments you might have.
Und ich darf sowohl die Gäste im Saal
and
als
I'd like to
auch
ask
an
all
den
our
Geräten
guests,
darauf hinweisen,
both those at
wir haben
home and in here, I'd like to point out to you that we have live blogging going on, which we can observe in parallel over here on the monitor, for those of you who are in the room with us. At the back, we have 5 or 6 staff members who'll be reporting on the event. So we'll have photographs, background reports, and also some highlights of the speeches and discussions. You'll be able to see all that after the event. So even if you're participating today, you can read up on that at a later stage, and the same applies to guests online. You can also watch the live blog. I would also ask all of you to put your phones on silent. Now is a good opportunity for doing it, and well, then we are almost ready. We are now waiting for the Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz to arrive. When he arrives, the guests above me and participants in the live stream will see him arrive. In the live stream, we'll comment on that just briefly until he's up here on the stage, and then the program officially starts. So everyone is ready, waiting. We'll give it a few minutes and then we'll make a start.
Sie können das Applaudieren gern schon mal üben.
You can practice applauding, definitely. Thank you.
ein kleiner Zwischenstand. Ist unterwegs.
Just to let you know, he's on his way. We just checked. We're waiting for Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz. I'm telling you on the live stream that we're waiting for Olaf Scholz to arrive, and as soon as he's here, we'll start the program.
Jetzt sehen wir, es bewegt sich etwas.
Now we can see movement.
Da kann man Olaf Scholz sehen, wie
We see Olaf Scholz arrive. He's being welcomed by Barbara Hendricks and Heidemarie Wieczorek-Zoll.
Und in ein Gespräch verwickelt.
There's a conversation going on.
Und ein Foto wird gemacht.
And a photograph is being taken.
Wollen wir hoffen, dass es bis zu uns schafft.
Let's hope that he'll make it all the way to the stage.
Genau, wir sind heute ja, für alle, die am Livestream nicht genau wissen.
So for all those who are not entirely sure, today we are being hosted by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Berlin, and Chancellor Scholz is coming into the room, and we'll make a start with our official program shortly.
Nochmal die Erinnerung.
Just as a reminder, please don't stand up, please don't wave your arms to those of you here in the room so that the camera can capture everything perfectly.
Herzlich willkommen zum Festakt.
A very warm welcome to the event commemorating the 100th birthday of Egon Bahr. On behalf of the organisers, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the Willy Brandt Circle, I'd like to welcome you very warmly, both the live audience and also those of you who are listening through the live stream. This event is a hybrid event, which means the guests who are here tonight, there's only a limited number of guests who are physically present here, have all been freshly tested. I'm hoping that you on the live stream are also enjoying good health, and it's great to have you follow us. In order to start officially, I'd like to ask to the stage the long-standing federal minister and member of the board of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Dr. Barbara Hendricks.
Sehr geehrter Herr Bundeskanzler, lieber Olaf Scholz,
Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Federal President Dr. Fischer, Federal President Dr. Köhler, ambassadors, the President, members of the German Bundestag, Adelheid Bahr, Petra and Wolfgang Bahr, Mrs. Engel, Heidemarie Wieczorek-Zoll. I'd like to welcome you very warmly on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation to the event that commemorates the 100th birthday of Egon Bahr. Today we want to celebrate the life work of a great social democrat who was a forerunner of reconciliation and has entered the history of reunified Germany. He's also entered the history of European peace politics. Egon Bahr impressed all of us. He inspired us. We are particularly pleased that you are here tonight, dear Olaf Scholz, our Federal Chancellor, to speak some words of commemoration. In our uncertain times, where there are no certainties any longer, where it is particularly important to reconsider our European security policy, we welcome this. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Heinz Fischer, former federal president of Austria, who has titled his speech "Some Words of Thanks." Welcome to you. When the Friedrich Ebert Foundation planned to commemorate Egon Bahr on his 100th birthday, this was a long time before the inexcusable war of aggression waged by Russia. The term of turning point entered our vocabulary soon after, and ever since the question has been raised how and if Bahr's concepts still seem useful. What do we mean today when we say change through rapprochement, which he sketched out in 1963 in his famous Tutzing speech? We hear that today is a time of weapons and not rapprochement. That trust had been destroyed for a long time to come. This may be true. At the same time, we should be aware of the fact that Egon Bahr's conceptions back then in the 1960s also came to fruition in a period that was characterized by mistrust and irrefutable systematic contrasts. That might give us courage to face up to the reality of the status quo, to reassess the status quo, and then to turn it into what Egon Bahr termed a policy of small steps towards peace, towards security. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation wants to play its part in this. With today's commemoration, we want to consider the life and work of Egon Bahr. We want to sketch out his thoughts and his ideas, which made him so important and influential. And we want to reassure ourselves of his inheritance. We are pleased for Egon Bahr, who, as a social democrat, did so much for the common security of Europe and who has lasting European significance. I look forward to entering into a conversation with all of you, and I'm pleased to give the floor now to Heidemarie Wieczorek-Scheuel, chairwoman of the Willy Brandt Circle. Thank you.
Lieber Olaf Scholz, lieber Heinz Fischer.
Der Olaf Scholz, der Heinz Fischer, dear Federal President, dear Adelheid, all the formal words of welcome have already been spoken, so I'll be brief and say that we welcome the Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz. I did wonder whether he would make it, even though he'd agreed a long time ago to join us tonight. I appreciate that he made the time to come here tonight, despite the many responsibilities he currently has to shoulder. We appreciate this a lot. Thank you very much for coming.
Wir alle richten an diesem Tag
on this day, one day before the 100th birthday of Egon Bahr, we are sending a passionate appeal. Stop the war. Stop bombing hospitals. Stop bombing human beings. These are crimes of war, crimes against international law, crimes committed by Putin.
Egon Bahr
founded the Willy Brandt Circle in 1997, and I'm pleased that I'm one of his successors. With his Ostpolitik and the reconciliation with our Eastern European neighbours after the Second World War and the barbarism committed by the Nazi regime, he did everything that war would no longer be possible in Europe. He did everything for peace. He would be shocked to see that soldiers are once again involved in a war of aggression in Europe. We are honouring Egon Bahr for his historic achievements for the Ostpolitik, which helped to overcome the division of Germany ultimately. And tomorrow, during the 5th Egon Bahr Symposium, we have had one in the 4 previous years, we'll be discussing what short and medium-term answers we can give following the outbreak of war in Europe. I'm sure that there will be an expansion of the European Union as the only democratic ordering power, but that's a point we need to discuss jointly tomorrow. I thank everyone who fled their country. I thank everyone who is helping the refugees. We are receiving them with arms wide open. We're doing what we can, and it's good that we are using whatever means that are at our disposal to support Ukraine, including also the delivery of weapons that we're helping Ukraine to defend itself. Thank you also, and the word to Heinz Fischer, thank you to you because you have taken the trouble to come here tonight. Heinz will be speaking after Olaf, but Olaf, the floor is now yours. We are very glad that you were able to come, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Lieber Adelheid Bahr,
Adelheid Bahr, Federal President Fischer, Federal President Köhler, Heidemar Wieczorek-Zeul, Barbara Hendricks, ladies and gentlemen. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has shaken the peaceful order in Europe. Very deliberately, I spoke of a turning point in the Bundestag. Egon Bahr and also Willy Brandt have seen several such turning points. Nazi fascism and the disaster of the Second World War, the division of Germany and Europe, and eventually the fall of the Iron Curtain. Over the past few weeks, I often wondered what would the two of them say today in this epochal turnaround. And this is the reason why I found it so important to just somehow manage to be here today, because it's a question that really keeps me busy, and it's an honor for me to say a few words. Egon Bahr was of the opinion that changes start in the mind. Rather than deploring the status quo, he spoke back in 1965, just 4 years after the construction of the wall, about the conditions for reunification. He had one vision that urged him on all his life, securing peace and freedom in Europe, because that is what matters above all, then and now. Let me share 3 ideas with you here. The first idea is this: Ostpolitik has never been a specifically German idea, a specifically German solution, and it never must be. Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr knew exactly where they were. The opening up toward the east was firmly rooted in the West. Without Kennedy's speech on peace, without the first tacit, later benevolent support of the United States, and without its embeddedness in Europe, such a policy would have been impossible. In the historic debate on the Eastern Treaties, 50 years ago, nearly to the day, Willy Brandt put it in a nutshell: a patriotic policy in Germany can only a European policy today. And it's true for us as well. Our policy regarding Russia must be a common European policy. At the time, Brandt and Bahr had to talk to Moscow first in order to achieve détente in the relationship with Warsaw, Prague, or East Berlin. Today, we are in a different situation. When we talk with Warsaw, Prague, or Bucharest, we are dealing with independent sovereign states, with friends and partners in the European Union and in NATO. This is the reality on which our policy is based. And the Russian president must accept and recognize this reality, which he doesn't do. I had a chance to talk to him for a long time and also mention this idea. It's always about the idea whether the fact of the European unity is accepted or whether it's questioned. Whether it's questioned that there is such a union and that this influences the order in Europe. When you accept that there is a European Union, and when people want to cooperate with the European Union in order to push their own development forward. Anyway, I told the EU ambassadors in Moscow after my meeting in the Kremlin a few weeks ago. I kept saying our biggest strength in this crisis is our unity. Over the past few weeks, we have provided proof of this unity, and for Germany, it means that our policy is being and will be harmonized and integrated on a European basis to enable the European consensus. With this objection in mind, we will meet end of next week in the European Council to set the course in the direction of European sovereignty. Everything that is seen as a specifically German solution, especially in the relationship with Russia, is harmful to us, harmful to our security, and harmful to Europe. My second point concerns the issue as to how we preserve our European peace order. Egon Bahr did not have such a peaceful order. He had to work for it. This also explains the only apparently paradox in Egon Bahr's Tutzing speech, that the status quo has to be overcome, which requires, for the time being, not to overcome it, but maintain the status quo. His long-term objective was to overcome the unsatisfactory status quo, the division of our country. But today, the situation is entirely different. We have the greatest interest in protecting the security order in place since Helsinki forever. By waging war on Ukraine, Russia is about to destroy the status quo. Putin wants to turn the clock back to a time when the big powers split up the map between them, a time when the countries in Central and Eastern Europe were merely seen as buffer zones or zones of influence. However, time does not run backward. This is something we need to explain to the Russian leadership. We do this by defending our rule-based order with determination against attacks that we currently see. Anything else would mean to open up Pandora's box. If borders are shifted forcibly in Europe, one glance at historic maps is enough to see the danger. This is why we Germans need to realize that it was the great achievement of Egon Bahr, Willy Brandt and others who fought so resolutely for the borders as they were, that the Oder-Neisse border is what is there to stay, and everyone casting doubt on that are seen as anti-progressive forces. But what would happen if you look at history books, look at the borders of the past, look at who speaks the same language or a similar language, and then drawing the conclusion that it must all be turned back again. And this is what you understand from the Russian president's essays and speeches. He did exactly that, came up with doubtful and controversial historic thesis, and for Europe this would be a disaster if we simply looked at past histories of peoples and nations and countries, we need to prevent that. This is why we told Moscow very clearly from the beginning of the crisis, the pillars of the European peace order, the inviolability of the borders are not negotiable. This leads to my third point. It concerns the dictum coined by Egon Bahr: peace in Europe is possible only with rather than against Russia. This dictum is still correct, yet at the same time we must also realize that the current policy of the Russian leadership is a real threat to European security. This is the regrettable starting point of a policy toward Russia, which, according to Egon Bahr, needs to start by looking soberly at the reality. But we must not stop there. When you want peace, you must be ready to negotiate. We too keep all channels for talks open and use all options that exist to mediate. This is why the French president and I, together or separately, talk to President Putin. This is why we keep in close contact with other influential partners, naturally with the United States, but also with China, Turkey and Israel, or our allies elsewhere. Whether these talks will lead to progress or even to a political solution is impossible to say at the moment. No one knows whether Russia will stick to what is achieved at the talks that are currently held with Ukraine, or use the time to make its own troops advance, or whether there will be real progress that helps to Ukraine and its president and the people to accept the proposals. But this will not deter us. One thing is clear: peace will only be achieved through a ceasefire and negotiations. And one thing is clear: we are not naive. Dialogue is not an end in itself. Dialogue, especially with Russia, requires to be strong ourselves. Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr knew that. And because this is currently hotly debated, the highest percentage increase in defense spending in the Federal Republic of Germany happened during their term of office. Willingness to have a dialogue must go hand in hand with a willingness to defend our values and principles against all attacks. When democracy, freedom and human rights are attacked, as we see now in Ukraine, then words must be followed with action. This is why we will continue and strengthen our political and economic support for Ukraine. This is why we decided to deliver weapons to Ukraine for self-defense. It's a decision that was not easy to make, but it was necessary and is correct. And just as necessary and correct are the tough sanctions that we have agreed over the past few days and weeks together with our friends and partners. By the way, they were prepared long in advance. It doesn't make sense to agree on political sanctions and then to say, well, what could it be? And since we knew that a scenario could happen, that we need them very quickly, we dealt with that issue very long in order to find the very most efficient sanctions. And the effect seems to prove that. After all, we shouldn't forget either that what is at stake in Ukraine is also our own values and our own peaceful order. Ladies and gentlemen, but there will be one mistake that we will avoid at all costs. Putin will not be equated with Russia. It's not the Russian people that made the fatal decision to attack Ukraine. This war is Putin's war. Ukraine wants peace. We want peace with Russia and the Russian people. This This distinction is important. It is important in order not to jeopardize reconciliation between Germans and Russians after the Second World War. It's important in order not to dig ditches between us and the many citizens with Ukrainian and Russian roots living here in our country. And it's important in order to demonstrate to the courageous Russian men and women who take to the streets protesting against Putin's war of aggression, to show them you are not alone. We are with you at your side. It is that Russia that gives us the hope that times will improve, also in the relationship between Germany and Russia. When I visited Moscow a few weeks ago, I also talked to representatives of Russia's civil society. The civil society there is under enormous pressure. One of the people told me, you know, democracy grows from inside us people. The courageous men and women in the streets in Petersburg, Moscow or Novosibirsk prove that he's right. They show that there is another Russia alive than Putin's Russia. This other Russia is the foundation to build the German-Russian foundations of the future. I know that this is a matter close to the hearts of many of you. I would like to thank all those who strengthen and maintain contact with the Russian civilian population in various organizations. Your work is more important now than ever. Ladies and gentlemen, I know Egon Bahr would have joined the discussion today with a lot of passion about the limits and opportunities of a Ostpolitik that is up to date. I still remember our joint time in Hamburg. Egon used to be the head of the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy. He was not one to mince his words. Time does not only have challenges, time also has its own answers. One thing was clear for Egon Bahr. Unless the answer is a fatalistic one, that you can't do anything, you need to find out what you can do. That was his claim, and that is also our claim today. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank an Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz.
Thank you very much to Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Ich habe schon gehört, ein vielbeschäftigter Mann. Sie müssen
I heard already you are a busy person. You need to leave us almost immediately. It was very nice to have you. But that gives me the opportunity to point you to the live blogging where you can read up some of the highlights or aspects that were touched upon in the speeches. So feel free to have a look, even though you may be here in person. It's a good opportunity to read up on what has been going on. So Olaf Scholz is saying goodbye to us now. The Federal Chancellor, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Für alle, die im Livestream jetzt mittlerweile dazugekommen sind,
all those who've joined us on the live stream, just to repeat what I announced right at the beginning, there are possibilities to write comments or questions into the chat. There's a little box below the live stream. These are questions that we can later on perhaps come to. At the same time, there's also the possibility to go to the home page of the Egon Bahr 100 page. There's a very good summary of background information and the life of Egon Bahr and also a picture gallery. So feel free to have a look at that. Otherwise, don't forget the hashtag Egon Bahr 100. Please use it for comments or anything you wish to say on the topic at hand. So you can use that here live, but also, of course, at home. Now let me move on to some words of thanks. Our next speaker is a man who was a good friend of Egon Bahr's. From 2004 to 2016, he was Federal President of the Republic of Austria. So now I have the honor of welcoming Dr. Heinz Fischer.
Liebe Adelheid, lieber
Dear Adelheid, dear Federal President Köhler, dear family of Egon Bahr's, and ladies and gentlemen. I firstly wish to say that I was very impressed and calmed to some degree by the words we have just heard. And I'm delighted that the 100th birthday of Egon Bahr here in Berlin is being marked in this particular way. I'm grateful that I've been invited to attend this event and to speak some words of thanks, because it is an opportunity for me to thank the human being that Egon Bahr was and the statesperson, just like I did at the commemorative event to honor Egon Bahr in November 2015. Egon Bahr was born shortly before the brutal murder of the then German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau. In Germany and in other parts of Europe, this was a tough period. People born at that time experienced unemployment and the rise of Hitler, Mussolini and Franco and also Stalin. As teenagers, they experienced the growing pressures of dictatorships in all the countries mentioned, and as young adults and as young soldiers, in many cases, they experienced the Second World War with all the terrible, awful consequences it had. That influenced many people from that generation. After the war, a new, peaceful chapter in the history of Germany and Europe seemed to begin. But it was a huge task for some individuals and for peoples. Peace was the big goal, and Egon Bahr made an essential contribution to this goal. Shortly after the 100th birthday of Alexander Dubček, only a few months ago, and the 100th birthday of Władysław Bartoszewski a few weeks ago, so of contemporaries of Egon Bahr, Egon Bahr is celebrating his 100th birthday today. A man of whom we can say that his influence made an enormous contribution towards overcoming the division of Germany, a contribution that also turned the history of Europe towards the better. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, in remembering Egon Bahr in November 2015, said only few politicians are given the opportunity to change the world with an idea and to live long enough to see this reality, this idea become reality. In the case of Egon Bahr, this really took place and applied, and we are grateful for that. I met Egon Bahr in February 1976. Back then, he was Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation in West Germany, and the Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky invited him to give a talk on the policy of détente. Later there was a dinner in Kreisky's villa in Armbruster Gasse. A few months ago, I'd become the head of the parliamentary group of the SPÖ, I was allowed to be there, and I was fascinated by the logic and precision in Egon Bahr's thoughts. I was also fascinated by his dry and unpretentious manner. By the way, the information provided by Egon Bahr was very precise in many fields. Preparing for tonight's event, the Bruno Kreisky Archive in Vienna lent me a report of the then Austrian ambassador in Bonn, Dr. Wilfried Gretler, I knew him well, which, amongst others, notes, dated 15th November 1974, strictly confidential. It notes a conversation, and I quote, as part of a confidential conversation with the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation, Egon Bahr, he declared that, in his opinion, for Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, he did not see many opportunities to ever chair the German Social Democrats, full stop. He had not done himself any favours. Schmidt was highly intelligent and decisive, but had little ability to integrate. End of quote. What Egon Bahr told ambassadors and what ambassadors then reported back to Vienna is captured there well. Ladies and gentlemen, for Austria, which borders Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Yugoslavia, the concept of change through rapprochement was essential. Egon Bahr developed this concept as the closest supporter of Willy Brandt. It was particularly attractive because it came close to the Austrian idea of a route towards overcoming the division of Europe. These three words, change through rapprochement, spoken in 1963, even gained more weight when Brandt became Federal Chancellor in 1979 and Kreisky soon after became Federal Chancellor of Austria. We were, and still are, in Vienna and in many other countries, very grateful that Egon Bahr and Willy Brandt spent so much intellectual and political energy on overcoming the unhappy division of Germany and Europe. Austria, of course, was able to evade that same fate much earlier. I accompanied him on many of his travels, also in Eastern European contexts, and I was able to observe how the thoughts of Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr were often referred to. And you could feel that there were positive reactions to this in the so-called Eastern Bloc. And I recall something else in a good way. For a number of years, I worked with Bruno Pittermann, one of the former chairpersons of the SPÖ, who succeeded Erich Hollenhauer and was the predecessor of Willy Brandt. From 1964 to 1976, he was president of the Socialist International. The SI, well, I remember Eberhard Dingels and his tireless efforts was something I was very familiar with, and of course I regret deeply what the SI has come to today. Willy Brandt, during the last years of his presidency, wanted to come back to wanted to replace the old Declaration of Principles by a new one, which during the conference in spring 1989 in Stockholm was in fact agreed. And for this purpose, Willy Brandt organized a small working group. I was a member of that working group, and in a year's intensive work, a declaration of principles was completed. When it came to questions concerning Eastern Europe and the relationship between communists and social democrats or the future of the détente, we worked closely with Egon Bahr. We asked for his advice And we thanked him once the new Declaration of Principles was agreed unanimously a few months before the fall of the Iron Curtain. By the way, it was the last SI Congress in which Willy Brandt still took an active part. The following Congress in Berlin, we all know, he sent a written statement through Hans-Jochen Vogel. He wasn't able to attend in person anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, on 30th September 1996, Egon Bahr spent some time in Vienna. He presented his biography with the title During My Times. He wrote a dedication in my copy of the book. He wrote, "I hope that you'll enjoy it, brackets, work and reading. Best wishes, Egon Bahr." This was a period when Egon Bahr, after the death of Willy Brandt and Bruno Kreisky, was able to look back at a Europe that was developing well from the perspective of an elder statesman. The grand goal of overcoming the division of Europe and the division of Germany had been achieved, something that Egon Bahr and others had been working for a long time, and they had been criticized for it, and they had experienced many setbacks along that route. But as we were all about to find out, history never ends. And when we speak about that particular era, we need to, of course, also mention Helmut Kohl. I last received a letter from Egon Bahr on 8th of May 2015. It was the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. He wrote, "Dear Heinz, I'm sending you the speech for which I was given standing ovations in the Adlon. I believe this is the end of my political thought and a political career that began with my idea of change through rapprochement." And it was an end because 3 months later, Egon Bahr had died. You all know the many well-wishers that spoke and the many words of appreciation that were received from all over the world. And those were words of thanks that were true words of thanks. Egon Bahr would have been most pleased about the words of his former opponent and later good friend, Henry Kissinger, who wasn't known as someone spreading compliments. But in his obituary, he wrote, "I can't think of any other politician who had better analytical qualities or capacities than Egon Bahr." And he was absolutely right. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be surprised that I haven't mentioned the words Putin and Ukraine so far in my speech. And indeed, around the 100th birthday of Egon Bahr, it is, of course, required to try to answer the question of whether the latest tragic and dangerous development, the brutal war of aggression of Putin on neighboring Ukraine, actually casts a shadow, a retrospective shadow on the policy developed by Egon Bahr and Willy Brandt. I would say it doesn't. The policy of détente put forward by Bahr, Brandt and others will not be proven wrong overnight, just because the Russian president, decades later, has lost every measure, is trampling on international law. The stability of relations between Europe and Russia, and especially Germany and Russia, continues to be important. That remains true today. Also, many single steps, small steps that were taken by Bahr and Brandt during their lifetime or proposed by them always had one objective, namely, and I quote Egon Bahr, a responsible partnership between Germany, Washington and Moscow. This objective was right then and continues to be right today, even though we may wish to add Beijing today. Putin gave a speech in the German Bundestag in 2001, and he said it again at the Munich Security Conference in less friendly terms. Maybe we should have listened more closely. But nothing justifies the action taken by someone who has hardened, has changed, in my opinion. The action of a Russian president who just tramples on international law, a president who has attacked Ukraine. And I have no doubt that Egon Bahr would have found some clear words on this. Trust that has been built over decades have been swept aside, have been destroyed. What Putin did and continues to do is the worst setback for democratic Europe since the death of Stalin, who destroys trust, destroys the ground upon which new trust can grow. And other spheres of life, such as culture and sport, are being damaged by this in the long term. A journalist wrote in Austria when several cultural events were cancelled with Russian participants, said, quite rightly in my opinion, our problem is Putin and not Pushkin. That seems to be well put, in my opinion. Finding ways out of today's situation is extremely difficult. In my opinion, Germany is doing very good work, which was well argued as well, and is well supported. The idea of military neutrality of Ukraine based on negotiations is a thought that, in my opinion, should at least be considered. Putin would not like this in this form. Maybe Zelensky would also not like this. But this may be a small opportunity for deliberations along those lines. Dear friends, let's come back to Egon Bahr. He would have been particularly pleased about the fact that on the occasion of his 100th birthday, a book is about to be published, where friends, contemporaries of different political colour have written contributions that all are dedicated to the person of Egon Bahr and his interests. It's impossible to list all the various authors and the various topics covered by the book, but the fact that President Steinmeier is one of the authors, just like Henry Kissinger, leaders of the SPD and representatives of other political parties, and a long list of friends and experts gives this book particular weight. The title of the book is called ... We have a chance, refers to a conversation that was held in 2012, 10 years ago. Egon Bahr was asked, can the world still be saved? He answered, I quote, as an optimist that I've always been and still am, I conclude, the future looks 50-50. there's a 50-50 chance that the world survives. No more, but we have a chance. End of quote. That's an actually frighteningly contemporary quote, to which I must add that this opportunity, this chance of survival is actually much bigger. It has to be more than 50-50. Because this is precisely why people like Egon Bahr and many others have done such great work. And I do still believe that this work has borne fruit, because it's not just the physical laws of preserving energy that counts. I think there's also a law of preservation of mental and intellectual energy. Ladies and gentlemen, from all that has been said, we take the great appreciation and gratitude to Egon Bahr, which I have tried to communicate as best as I can. There's a saying which is, only those who have been forgotten are truly dead, and Egon Bahr is certainly not forgotten. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank an Dr. Heinz Fischer.
Thank you, Dr. Heinz Fischer. We will now have a very small break in order to rearrange the chairs here. So you there in the audience are requested to stay where you are. The live stream will be back in 2 minutes, and then we will continue. Thank you.
Herzlich willkommen zurück.
Welcome back. I promised that we won't interrupt proceedings here for more than 2 minutes, and we didn't. We have set the stage here, leading to the next item on the agenda. It's a little more interactive than so far. We have a roundtable discussion. A Challenger Turns 100 is its title. It will be moderated by Dr. Irina Mohr. Would you join me up here, please? I'll briefly introduce you. Irina Mohr is the Deputy Head of the Political Education and Dialogue Department of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and she's a member of the Willy Brandt Circle. She will talk to 3 interesting guests, but she will introduce them herself. So you have the stage, Mrs. Mohr. I'm really happy to be able to participate in this event today, that we are able to meet here in persona, and I'm also happy to see that so many people have joined us on the live stream. It's a bit of a challenge here because it's people in the hall and people online, so we have to switch between these 2 types of audience occasionally. And I'm pretty sure that many people watching us on the live stream do not know very much about Egon Bahr and his dictum "change through rapprochement, policy of small steps" is something relatively new to them. So I think what the discussants will do here is to provide interesting information also to a new audience. Dr. Heinz Fischer, thank you very much for your encouraging speech. You said that when you still remember a person, he or she is still there, and that's precisely correct. That's the idea behind this event here. How can you remember somebody better than thinking about what he suggested and thinking about what he would say today? We know Egon Bahr, we met him, he inspired us, and the symposia we hold here in his name, such as the one we will hold tomorrow, are occasions to put his ideas to the current test. So I would like to ask my 3 guests to join me here on stage: Peter Brandt, Götz Neuneck, and Joachim Gießmann.
Peter, Götz und Hein, glaube ich. Ich hoffe, das hast du doch vorhin. Perfekt. Peter hier. Die Masken dürfen wir hier oben abnehmen.
You're allowed to take off your mask up here. So it's a big pleasure and honor to me to be able to be your host here now. I looked around a little bit, and this also explains the title. A Challenger Turns 100. It's a quotation by Brandt. In 1992, Willy Brandt wrote an article entitled "A Challenger Turns 70." And in it, he congratulated Egon Bahr on his birthday. It was on the 17th of November, exactly 30 years ago. So this is why we called it A Challenger Turns 100. The full text of the essay is available on the portal of our Friedrich Ebert Foundation, where you can find lots of information about Egon Bahr, his biography, his thoughts, his life, his positions, and I can invite all of you to have a look. We really tried hard to present Egon Bahr with his many facets as a politician, as a human being with lots of experiences, as a far-sighted provider of concepts for the future. I quote from his essay: "Not only his personal and political friends, but Germany as a whole, and quite a few others beyond our borders, have good reason to feel challenged by him." This is what Willy Brandt wrote on the 17th birthday of Egon Bahr. So let's be challenged tonight and tomorrow at the symposium, when we will have more specialists here, when we want to discuss how Egon Bahr's ideas can be applied to the current situation, what it means for politics now. Tonight, we have 3 guests here. And I can tell you all 3 are members of the Willy Brandt Circle. Peter Brandt is its deputy chairman. Götz, Neuneck and Hans-Joachim Gießmann are members of the Willy Brandt Circle, in which we discuss the current situation, policies of peace and security. We also draft appeals together with Heidemarie Wieczorek-Teul in order to shape the world in the meaning of Egon Bahr. I would like to introduce my guests to you, and I would like to start with a question. Where and how you met Egon Bahr? So, as you will have noticed, we are on very familiar terms with one another. Peter Brandt is a historian. He's a retired professor of modern and contemporary history. He's a member of the Historical Commission at the SPD Party Executive and on the board of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. He's also, as I mentioned, the deputy chairman of the Willy Brandt Circle. Peter, when you remember, perhaps you know Egon Bahr the longest. How did you meet him? I met him in 1960, I believe. So 1960, well, that perhaps makes me one of the people I know the longest. I was a child at the time, even though a big one. And the fact that I have the same name as a much more important person. My father used to be the governing mayor of West Berlin at the time, and Egon Bahr became the press spokesman of the Senate. And, well, there were occasions for the families to meet, and this is when I met Egon Bahr for the first time. I remember that I was traveling once with the two. That must be at the beginning of 1962, a few months after the construction of the wall. When you listened carefully, you heard a lot of things, because, of course, these two men continued talking no matter who was present. Such fathers are not the ones looking after their children all the time, so the two of them wanted to have a few days off, and my mother perhaps said, well, why don't you take the oldest child with you? And I really had a chance to listen, and I listened carefully, and I heard a lot. That was at the height of the Cold War, but they already thought about how to pave the way toward detente. The idea was triggered by the construction of the wall, and as we all know now, the Western allies, especially the United States, responded with a demonstration of reserve. They simply accepted it. For the Berliners, for the West Berliners, this was a shock, because they believed that traveling around in the city was part of the four-power agreement. And then, starting from that day, which triggered shocks in the population, the circle around Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr, Heinrich Alberts, Klaus Schütz, Dietrich Spangenberg, and a few others, the so-called Sacred Family, the Holy Family, they started to think about, well, if things are the way they are, how can we defend our specifically German and specifically Berlin interests? So Peter, the child, sat there and got an idea of the big contradictions of the times, and that was in Berlin, at a time when the new Ostpolitik was devised. Götz Neuneck. Professor Götz Neuneck is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. We already heard that's the institute that Egon Bahr chaired at his time. He was a contributor to Egon Bahr. He's an expert for arms control, disarmament, new technologies, nuclear weapons, missile defense and space armament. He's also very active in the Willy Brandt Circle. Welcome, Götz. And my question to you as well, how did you meet him? Well, that's easy. It was in 1986. That was at the height of the Second Cold War. The Cold War has several phases, as we know. With the occupation of Afghanistan, the problems were shifted very strongly towards the nuclear threat. The arms control agreements were under attack. I had studied physics, and in the 1980s, with the dual-track decision of NATO, people took to the streets. I had studied physics in Düsseldorf. For a while, I was in Starnberg with Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. The two knew one another quite well. There are interesting stories about the two and their talks, and the institute there gave me a chance to continue working. It's not easy for a physicist to move into politics. He was my boss was an expert, and it was new for him to move into different directions, and it was something new to discuss arms control and the like. He didn't use any footnotes. Journalists hate footnotes. The interesting question would have been, why would he become the director of a scientific institute? He wouldn't have a chance to do that today. There would be an evaluation committee, and the science community would reject him being a politician, and only that. At the time, Klaus von Donani recruited him and persuaded him to do it with the idea that, well, it would be good for politics. Nevertheless, the projects at the time were largely unfinished. So he based himself on scientific expertise when it was pragmatic, when it was concrete, when it was forward-looking. He listened to that. He was definitely not the master of fundamental essays and of profound, in-depth studies that stand on the shelf and nobody reads them. There was a pressure on the Institute's members to look very carefully at how political developments turn. He contributed to the Palme Commission. His contributions on common security fill 6 volumes, and they deal with all aspects of military and non-military issues of the time. He discussed that a lot with others. He led the institute as if he was a minister there. It was quite surprising to me. You joined a group of people, and then you one after the other were asked, "What do you think about that?" I was quite happy that I could at least base myself on natural laws, because I didn't know the laws of politics. It was a challenge, really, and as a result, we saw dramatic changes right until the fall of the wall. And Joachim Gießmann knows that as well. We were there as colleagues. He was a political scientist. I am a natural scientist. And we discussed the things from all angles.
Thank you very much. You mentioned Joachim Gießmann already. We'll move on to our next guest in a moment. Hans-Joachim Gießmann is Director Emeritus of the Berghof Foundation, still works for the Berghof projects in Afghanistan and Ethiopia. He was Executive Director of Berghof Conflict Research and of the Berghof Foundation. But before he joined Berghof, he was Deputy Director of the very institute for Peace Research and Security Policy. So, very warm welcome, Joachim Gießmann. So, same question to you. How did you meet Egon? And let me add something else, because well, after the fall of the wall, well, you studied at Humboldt University Berlin, you gained your doctorate there and your habilitation still in the GDR. And that, of course, lends your experience a different note. How did you get to know Egon Bahr? How did you experience him? What were the challenges? Well, my professional life began in 1981. That was an era of where despite the height of the Cold War, there was a gradual approach between GDR and West Germany. And there was a lot of discussion on how we could avoid that the two German states would become a battlefield of a nuclear war between the two superpowers at the time. And Egon Bahr's ideas fascinated me at the time. There were concepts like a community of security, so a range of terms that came up in the East and the West. And I remember that because in 1984 I wrote an essay on common security, which was inspired by Egon Bahr. And in the course of this thaw, I had the opportunity in 1985 to travel to Stockholm, to SIPRI, for a week. And Egon Bahr was on the board of SIPRI. And the board met in the same week that I was there. So I went to the canteen of the institute, and there he was. He looked at me questioningly, who are you, sort of. Then I said, okay, this is who I am, from the GDR, I'm here for a week. And Egon Bahr said, that's fabulous. I just got back from Moscow. And of course, he was strongly influenced by the talks he'd been having with Mikhail Gorbachev. And he said, we need to talk about this. And I thought, well, okay, that was it, probably. I mean, come on, Egon Bahr, he was, a very prominent figure for a young scientist like myself. And then he took me to one side and he spent an hour talking about Gorbachev and German relations. He was a fascinating listener. I mean, surely I wasn't, as intellectual as Egon Bahr was to us, but he took seriously what I said, and we really had a very intense conversation, and he knew the article I'd written in 1984. So that was really the beginning of a long sort of period of knowing him. And I repeatedly met Egon Bahr also in 1989, and he got me to Hamburg, really, to the institute at some point. Okay, so that means during the 1980s, this figure of light radiated all the way to East Berlin. Was that how it was received? Yeah, definitely. Freise is here as well. Numerous conversations did take place between the SED and the SPD, and also between the Hamburg Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy and the East Berlin Institute for Politics and Economics that I was part of. So some of the colleagues at the Hamburg Institute I already got to know in the 1980s. And those talks were really unheard of. Generals of the NVA and the Bundeswehr took part in those. No one else, I think, would have had the staying power to actually organize those rounds of talks at that period. Egon Bahr was able to do that. He was he couldn't. Well, he could get away with it, so to speak. Others might have thought they'd have to explain it. He just did it. And I think these conversations contributed a great deal towards preparing German reunification. And I think maybe that's often underestimated retrospectively. You just mentioned the conversation, Rolf Reissig in the audience. There was a paper in 1987, the famous and infamous, actually, SED-SPD paper that set out common ground. And also certain common terms or shared world views, maybe, or understandings were set out. That was in the 1980s. But yeah, I think it is we do underestimate how many conversations took place in the 80s that prepared reunification, even though Egon Bahr self-critically said that conversations that took place informally did neglect the movement in civil society. Is that true, do you think, or what would you say? Yes, he himself said it self-critically. He said he underestimated the public mood, but I wouldn't actually play one out against the other, because the talks that took place between West Germany and the GDR, with him participating, showed to the people in the GDR that they should have courage. They gave us courage because it reduced this idea of the enemy on the other side. So that it created an environment that allowed an opposition movement to arise, and the détente, the policy of détente, really made a huge contribution to that feeling. In 1989, 1990, I myself spoke to some representatives of the civil movements, also at the round table for the new forum. Some representatives of the movement criticized him for it. He said ignoring these movements had prolonged the history of the GDR. I don't think so. I think it was an important intersection between East and West. A building block at the intersection of East and West, and reunification was only possible because something happened that Egon Bahr didn't think could happen. German reunification, or German unity and European unity, and German reunification kind of overtook European unity at some stage, maybe. This is something that he was critical of retrospectively. Okay, I just want to remind everyone online that it's possible to ask questions in the chat. We'll get to those questions through our facilitators. It's also possible to ask questions here in person. So if you wish, please feel free to join our discussion. Let's go back to the 1960s. Peter, we started to talk about the 60s, and Barbara Hendricks said earlier that we should acknowledge that these concepts came about in a period that was characterized by rather strict and immovable blocks. I wanted to ask you, what's the method that Willy Brandt applied? And is that a method we can still resort to today, would you say? Well, the second question is the harder question, of course, but maybe answering the first question helps us to come to some conclusions on the second question. When the wall was constructed in Berlin, and the Cuba crisis that followed a year later, when the world was really at a turning point. We now know today that the situation was even more dramatic than we perceived, because de facto it's a compromise that resolved it. But it wasn't allowed to become public because of American internal policy. So the Soviets at the time withdrew their missiles from Cuba, and the Americans from Turkey, where mid-range weapons had been stationed a long time before. So that couldn't be talked about. But it was a beginning, because the two superpowers saw how dramatic the situation could become when you don't pay attention. And what they certainly didn't want was to wage war against one another, because it was clear that it would spell mutual destruction. Anything else was possible, except for a direct war against one another. And Europe was also too dangerous. I'm saying it as brutally as it was seen. And that was the point of departure. So under that umbrella, You know, that superpowers tried to find a modus vivendi through various steps, also contradictory steps. But that was the umbrella that made it possible to develop thoughts on the German situation within all this. So that maybe answers, well, that was maybe the answer of the federal government and the main political party supporting the government at the time. The idea was, we need to worry about them coming to an agreement above our heads. We need to slow things down. And the other thought was, how can we bring our ideas into that discussion? And that led to the thinking, it was quoted already by Kennedy, by the way, this led to the recognition that if we want to change the status quo, we need to recognize the status quo first of all. Maybe not de facto, but de jure for certainly. And in Berlin, we tried this policy of small steps. It wasn't a fully fledged concept from the beginning. You kind of looked, well, okay, how can we maybe step by step, maybe even without an official legal position of the Federal Republic of, without violating the official position of the Federal Republic of Germany, how can we use this visitation agreement that was drawn up in Berlin, how can that be made to work? And it was a specific situation in Berlin. I mean, what can we do to make it possible for families to visit one another again? You know, people needed to meet again. And then, based on that, step by step, and to begin with, the treaties between the West Berlin Senate and the East Berlin GDR government spelled out that agreement could not be reached on some terminology. And the GDR at some point, didn't play along with this anymore, but for 3 years at least it worked. So it was an attempt to somehow approach the other side. And Egon Bahr has always emphasized himself, I used to be a Cold Warrior, and the same is known about Willy Brandt. He was anti-Adenauer because he had other ideas, but it wasn't that they had particular sympathies for the GDR or the Soviet Union. But, you know, whenever such processes of rapprochement begin, then attitudes begin to shift on both sides. So that was the beginning. Then, during the period of the Grand Coalition, when things had been moving a little bit in German policy under Kiesinger and Brandt, when he was foreign minister, at that point, he was head of the planning staff in the Foreign Office. And that was an opportunity to think through many of the things that became implemented from 1969 onwards. Later on, it was said that there wasn't a single situation that they hadn't thought about beforehand. Now, of course, we can't check whether that's true, but he wasn't one to brag. Maybe just allow me one additional comment. You'd asked Hayo about Egon's self-criticism in how he underestimated civil society protests in East Germany. I would say the point of departure is that he thought in terms of states, and he did that fantastically. I tend to think more about society and conflicts within society, also within the Eastern Bloc, and that was fairly alien to him. I'm just saying that this wasn't his way of approaching it. And luckily, he acted the way he did in order to pave the way for states to come together. Because that helped civil society movements at a later stage. Yes, I remember a sentence, politics has to serve people. That was what he always held up high as a principle, but he linked it to you know, the policies for states. Yes, he was criticized for apparently not being interested enough in reunification. He said repeatedly, "I'm not worried about the nation. Let's not talk about it so much anymore." It's reminiscent of the French once they lost Alsace-Lotharingia. You know, think about it all the time, just don't talk about it. He just thought it was so deeply anchored, and it actually endangers the matter if we keep talking about this as the grand goal. It's interesting. You said that change through rapprochement actually changes both sides. Was he aware of that? Or what change took place on the Western side? I'm asking this as someone who comes from the East. What was the change that took place there? Well, the thinking changed, definitely. You know, ultimately, we had a solution of where the GDR kind of voluntarily joined West Germany. But in the mid-60s, that could not be foreseen. It wasn't anticipated like that. But in order to be able to take that route at all, a lot had to shift in terms of conceptual thought. I mean, Egon Bahr wasn't the only one. In other political parties, in the FDP, also amongst the CDU, there was more movement than is commonly perceived already in the mid-60s. So it's a process that began in the early 1960s, went along, and then kind of, continued in the 1970s. Yeah, and there was huge criticism and battles against the new Ostpolitik. The West, of course, wasn't always unified in that. West Germany, it was action that was oriented also along political party lines. When the treaties were debated, you know, all those were fought against hard by some. So politically, I would imagine, thinking also shifted in the 70s. Now, in the 70s, one question became more prominent. Lutz, I'm going to ask you now, which is the question of disarmament and nuclear armament. We had peace movements in the 70s. We had a strong turn towards questions of disarmament, especially concerning nuclear weapons. I wanted to ask Götz, how important was this to Egon Bahr? He chaired a subcommittee for disarmament in the German Bundestag. He instigated it. How important was this to him? And can you remember any leading thoughts that others could challenge?
Indeed. After the first phase of the Cold War, there came a phase that followed a phase of coexistence, arms control agreements, disarmament, as a result of which we saw a reduction of the confrontation, but it did not go away. As a scientist, I found it interesting to learn from him. You wondered about the method. In fact, I must admit that I didn't understand that right from the start. When we issue a brochure on his 70th birthday, we said we entitled it "Thinking in Paradoxes," and this is what he was great at. He could explain how legal issues can lead to concrete action. So paradoxes cannot be resolved. They are there, and you can change them only gradually in small steps. So disarmament is confronted with the desire to station to deploy every new systems. And the big powers understood in the Cuban crisis that a hotline was needed between them, because otherwise the whole thing will explode, might go up, and that's the end of everyone, because when it all goes up, we are all dead. This is an important realization because it forces you to look at your arsenals, and then you discover, well, 70,000 warheads are a bit much, really. As a result, we saw the first phase of arms control negotiations, and in 1968, Brandt and Bahr continued. Nixon and others followed suit because both governments in Washington and Moscow understood that this was a high priority. The problem now is that the administration under Trump didn't see that as a priority. The knowledge of what a potential nuclear war means is gone. Politicians know nothing about the details of that, and in the crisis over Ukraine, we are now confronted with that issue. So we need more arms control. We need a hotline between the big powers again. We can only hope that it works, and a hot war can lead to the question, will it perhaps lead to the use of nuclear weapons? It is possible because we still have 6,000 nuclear warheads in the Russian arsenal. There are similar numbers in the American arsenal. So arms control is stagnating. We didn't go far enough. In the Institute, we invested a lot of effort in making this known. With the OSCE argued for a European security system that would make arms control possible. All that didn't really lead to a new European peace order. We are now confronted with a lot of problems, with a lot of fragments and devastations, but it doesn't mean that we cannot return to what makes sense. The other principle is that of the inviolability of borders, which is also under attack now as a principle. But we need to return to the old principles of the CSC, today the OSCE, which is occasionally difficult because at the moment the logic of war prevails. But it is possible, and I do not think that the objectives we wanted to achieve in the 1970s and 80s cannot be reactivated. However, we can do that only when the current war is finished. So this is the logical conclusion from the old dictums to the new ones. At the moment, we must admit we have the tools that we need: transparency, the Vienna document, the CSCE agreement. All these contracts and agreements and treaties are currently shelved, but they are possible. They can be revived if we want to continue to work on a new peace order in Europe. And I think we could find a couple of interesting ideas in Bahr's writings. We don't have the time here to go into details. There are things like parity, verification, and so on and so forth involved, but you also need a minimum of opportunities. Well, we could actually develop a counter theory. This is why I found ex-President Fischer's speech so interesting. At the moment, we are required to remember these old principles, and it could mean that states and countries and nations become aware of the toolset, the toolkit we have and could use. Perhaps we have a chance tomorrow to discuss the practical implementation of all that. So I will keep high the principle of hope here. And I'm absolutely confident that we do have a chance. We just have to start thinking again and apply that new thinking to the current situation. Bahr himself said at one point that the German issue and the issue of nuclear bombs have kept me busy all through my life. The German issue has been resolved. The nuclear issue has not been resolved. And this is a challenge because we have to deal with the technology here. When, as a physician, physicist, I need to say that, well, when we have so many nuclear arsenals that can destroy the world many times over, this arsenal is still there. We cannot ignore it, we cannot deny it, and it means that we need to discuss it because there's no other chance to disarm than getting away from that. There are lots of other challenges, climate change, hunger, and others. So we need a serious dialogue, and hopefully the talks currently going on that went on between the United States and Russia will be revived. The talks went on even during the Cold War. At the moment, everything is stalled, which is kind of worrying because it looks as if the governments are no longer seriously interested. Well, at the moment, we see how important the issue of the armaments is, and especially nuclear armaments, because Moscow has nuclear weapons and is ready, obviously, to risk a war. Egon Bahr said that the maintenance of world peace is of a higher priority than the implementation of ideologies. I think this was a remarkable statement at the time. He said it means that the joint survival is more important than the risk of joint destruction. But we do have a chance. So now I want to deal with a question from the chat. When Egon Bahr looked at states rather than other players, how would he have dealt with things like the swing to the right, the pandemic, the climate crisis, the issues we have today? So how would Egon Bahr respond to those issues? Hayo, you nodded, so you seem to have an answer. No, of course I don't have an answer, but President Fischer and Chancellor Scholz referred to the need to maintain our rules-based order. What the dreadful things we see at the moment, the attack on Ukraine, is not just the destruction or the causing harm to that order. It also throws us back. And the issues that kept us busy until 4 weeks ago tend to be neglected at the moment: climate change, pandemic, and so on. So we must not forget, we must not ignore, we must not overlook these issues. They are burning issues and they require cooperation on the global level. So stalling them doesn't lead anywhere. The Russian leadership seems to believe at the moment that its interests can be achieved with the help of force. But that still doesn't mean that we can ignore the global challenges of which we are already aware, and they require cooperation just as well. People in Moscow who are currently the influential ones seem to ignore that. The START agreement was extended, was without previous long drawn-out negotiations. So obviously there is some interest not to scrap everything, but it's a huge waste of time with regard to all the issues I mentioned, and it may be difficult to catch up because time is running out for us. So I think the methodology developed by Egon Bahr that has always fascinated me, saying on the one hand, we must put forward maximum. We must not put forward maximum demands because we might not win anything. Or we might decide that small steps are best now. You need to have a line that you want to follow, and you need to have a big vision. And that is a principle that is still valid. So whatever we see at the moment, all the destructive potential, all the attacks on the international order, requires us to see what can be done, to find new allies, to find actors that are more willing to contribute. China was mentioned, India, other countries, where the consequences, the impact of all that becomes already obvious. So my plea would be to differentiate between Putin on the one hand and Russia on the other, as was said already, but also to be prepared to have to deal with not so easy and pleasant and maybe complicated partners in order to get the upper hand with regard to all the global challenges. Egon Bahr might have said so, that we should remember the model of common security that he very much encouraged and put forward. That's what we need to achieve at the end of the day. He also said a policy of all or nothing is completely meaningless. Peter, you wanted to say something on that as well. I would just like to add that the Willy Brandt circle, mentioned already, was set up by him because he also wanted to talk to people who he found interesting. And especially discussing issues that where he didn't feel as an expert. A crucial aspect in each discussion was foreign and security policy, of course, but he also found it important to have a balanced East-West circle. And when the East German circle, he wanted to have critical people from the official party, but also critical people from the opposition. He found that important. And as far as the West German partners were concerned, he wanted to have some sort of left-wing pluralism, but also people who were competent and knowledgeable with a different background. So he had a very clear-cut center of his ways of thinking. At the time of the old East-West conflict, the actual danger was not that one of the two sides would launch an unprovoked nuclear attack. The actual danger was that mutual errors could lead to a crisis and could actually escalate a crisis, so that incalculable things could happen. The Cuban crisis, by the way, we know that the military leadership told Kennedy it's the last chance for us to win a big nuclear war, and he didn't buy that. But after that, at least no one we know of had such mad ideas. But as I said before, we had incidents that in 1983 a great number of birds were mistaken as missiles. We were really lucky. No serious error happened. And we have obviously forgotten most of that. You cannot live with the awareness that something like that might happen any moment. So someone makes an error, and it's the end for all of us. Not just for us here, sitting here, and most of us are anyway a bit older, but it's the end for absolutely everyone, our children, grandchildren, for humanity as a whole. Götz, you nodded your head. So being a disarmament expert and expert for such armament issues, of course you can complain that such issues have become less important in the course of time. What is your view of that? These issues are of such crucial importance, and in what way do they have to be anchored in society? It's really difficult for disarmament experts like you to be heard in society. What is your experience? I think there are several reasons why society and the various forces there that Egon knew a lot about, but were not seen as major actors he could get involved with. Well, young people of today find all this a bit too complicated. Strategic calculations, paradoxes, an existential threat and the end of humanity within minutes. Young people have lost fear of all that, and for the peace movement and all those who've seen nuclear disarmament as the key issue find it difficult to speak about that time and again. We know a lot more these days. We know it's not about the destruction of just a few houses or towns and cities, but it's about the complete eradication of modern infrastructure. There won't be any hospitals. There will be short-term and long-term implications, and all these truths are so unpleasant, and how to respond to them is difficult. So the only answer is arms control, disarmament, realization, self-limitation, reduction of the arsenals. They are too big. And the problem is that it's not just about deterrence. Deterrence means that the other side will not use the nuclear weapons it has. But just as Peter said, there is concern that they might be used after all, and even to wage a war. The precision, ease of use, the use of combining them with conventional weapons, all these strategies are very unpleasant, but they have become further refined in recent years. And this led us into an overheated situation where you need to think about technical factors, missile defense. Often the claim is that you can stop these enormous arsenals when you have the right air defense in place. That's an illusion. But politicians tend to use that smokescreen in order to avoid too much involvement in details. It's not a good issue for young people. It's nothing interesting. Climate change enables you to take a personal approach, to respond, to participate in the Fridays for Future demonstrations, to change your lifestyle, your way of eating. I participated in lots of the demonstrations myself, but the worry that took us to the streets in the past is gone. It's Ukraine now, it's India, Pakistan, Iraq, the Korean Peninsula, whatever. These are big issues. And very often, politicians underestimate that because these places are not suitable as election campaign slogans. You cannot look at all this all the time. You push it into the back of your mind. You say, well, we will somehow manage. Most people today don't know what the real risk is. But now in the crisis over Ukraine, all these issues are there again. Things where we try to find an answer, and the only answer was we need to reduce the arms arsenals. We need to reduce nuclear risks. We need communication between the two sides. Only when the two sides cooperate will we have a chance to control the nuclear monster. And just as Egon Bahr said, the guiding principle in the 21st century is cooperation. The pandemic can only be fought through joint strategies. No state alone will be able to do it. We depend on scientific data from other states. We depend on the vaccination programs elsewhere. We need public attention. And the same goes for disarmament. We need to be aware of the risk of the end of the world, but we need cooperation. It sounds paradoxical, but politicians should understand that, because a nuclear confrontation would lead to the end of the world as we know it. And we see that now, and politicians need to respond. I think this is what Egon Bahr would say now. We mustn't forget either that it worked quite well for a while under Gorbachev. But it was not just the fall of the wall, it was also the initiatives taken by Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr, who traveled to Moscow and suddenly saw that a man by the name of Gorbachev understood that very well. The current ruler there obviously has no idea of any of that. So this is why we now have to do with irrationalism for us as Westerners. And how to deal with that? I think we need time to get prepared. The problem is that people are dying now because of that.
We have a question from the chat on the current situation, of course. And while you were speaking, I thought there's another paradox, namely that economic cooperation globally has grown enormously. It's just that politics and nationalist politics is not following. So there's a misalignment that we might have to consider. Now, of course, based on the sanctions, we see how everything is interlinked. The pandemic was another indicator that everything is closely interlinked. Anyway, the question from the chat is, why were the leaders, the world leaders, not able to stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the first phase? Can we say that there wasn't enough Egon Bahr, maybe in that initial phase? What do you think? I think Federal President Fischer, you spoke of 2001 and 2007, the Munich Security Conference. I think the signs go back a long way now, the signs of change in Russian politics than is insinuated by the beginning of the Russian invasion. But yes, we have to ask, now in a positive sense, did we understand this? Are we understanding the discussion that has gone on in Russia over the last years, or did we maybe not want to perceive this because we were still seeing Russia as a constructive partner in Europe based on the post-Gorbachev idea, and suddenly we are waking up in a world that is fundamentally different? So early signs of what has now happened acutely became apparent first in 2014. What we're experiencing now, well, on the one hand, I feel like I'm back in the 1980s, you know, when you in the West and we in the East, we tried to calculate a balance that could act as a stabilizing force, but it was really a narrowing of political thinking. And Egon Bahr always assumed that nothing has to stay the way it is. It's imperative to overcome, you know, blinkers in our thinking. But what we can forget sometimes is that this also works the other way around in a negative sense. Today we are faced with a situation which first became apparent in 2014 and again now, when a nuclear power is waging a war of aggression on a neighboring country and is threatening the use of nuclear arms in order to secure territorial gains. So the question is, how can you stop a regime from doing exactly that? And disarmament does not give you an answer. I think we need to urgently think about how we can use trust and security to create framework conditions that still allow political action to be taken in a situation where apparently interests are diverging and willingness to cooperate decreases. And that really is a turning point. It's a different era. It's that dawn of a new era that the Federal Chancellor has spoken about. And I think we are just at the beginning of this new era. Unfortunately, this does not help Ukraine right now. But I do believe that the signal of absolute unity, not just of the West, but also beyond the West, and universal criticism of Putin's actions can be cause for optimism that this war cannot be won by Russia. I remember, you said it earlier, I spent the last 4 years working in Afghanistan. I remember the withdrawal of the then Soviet forces from Afghanistan. That was instigated to a large degree by the mothers of the soldiers, mindful of 10 to 12,000 dead soldiers. They were exerting enormous political pressure in Russia. If the propagandistic curtain that Russia has drawn over the destruction of Ukraine, once that curtain is pulled away, once Russians become aware of what is really going on, then different developments might be possible. So creating transparency on what is occurring is one of the most important tasks that we have right now. So that brings us back to the important connection between civil society and the state. Peter, some very brief concluding words, because we're nearly out of time. 2 words? Okay, I can't manage 2 words, but maybe 2 sentences. We know now that the invasion of Ukraine has been planned for about a year. We only understood this retrospectively. Putin had no interest in talking to Europeans. He wanted to talk to the Americans. If that would have done anything, we don't know. But it's one thing to talk about the war. We all pretty much agree on our assessment on that. And the other thing is the history that came before. And if anything went wrong, it's in the early phase, in the early 90s, when other opportunities could have been taken. Yeah, you're shaking your head, but I'm just saying maybe. I'm saying maybe. I'm just saying the one doesn't necessarily answer the other. But maybe we need to state that the opposite principle is also approved. There's change through distance. Maybe that's the mistake we made. Okay, we've nearly come to the end of our discussion. I'd like to close with a quote by Frank-Walter Steinmeier, a little anecdote that he told. He was talking about Egon Bahr. He said he calls every few months. I need exactly an hour. He usually arrived 5 minutes before the time, sat down in the big chair next to me, and then we sat next to one another for exactly an hour. And we talked until he said, "I'll leave now. You have more important things to do." And just as punctually as he arrived, he departed. With the short steps he was so well known for. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have spent exactly an hour with Egon Bahr. That was the hour that brought him close to us, that allowed us to retrace some of his thoughts. Tomorrow, during the 5th Egon Bahr Symposium, we'll ask what all that means to us for the future, for the next steps, which may be small steps. I very much look forward to tomorrow. We have excellent panels, international participants. We invite everyone to join us tomorrow to answer some of the questions we have brought up today and to maybe contribute to some of these small steps, how we can respond with Egon Bahr on the situation we are faced with today. So that will be an important point of discussion for tomorrow. I hope that we'll have some interesting results, and I'd like to thank Peter Brandt, Götz, Neuneck and Gießmann for this panel, which has brought us close to Egon Bahr. So now we still have some time to spend together. There's some food. We can have a drink. We can perhaps continue some of the conversations we have started now. I'd like to thank everyone, also Heinz Fischer, Barbara Hendricks, Heidemarie Wieczorek-Zeul. Yes, thank you. And, well, a very good evening, and see you back tomorrow at 11 o'clock.
Fertig.
Thank you.